World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage from the Institute of World Affairs at UWM with another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Today we'll be looking at soon to be Un. The North Korean regime took another step towards perpetuating a communist dynasty with the anointing of leader Kim Jong-il's previously unheralded son, Kim Jong-un, as heir apparent. Will succession go smoothly, or might the kimchi hit the fan? Feeling unappreciated. The U.S. House passed a bill targeting China's undervalued currency, which sponsors say should be allowed to appreciate against the dollar. What are the likely effects, and is this political posturing or sound economic policy? Unsettled Question, Part 2. Fragile Palestinian-Israeli peace talks have so far survived a resumption of West Bank settlement construction and a hardline UN speech by Israel's foreign minister. Is this an empty exercise, or can new life be breathed into the process? And austerity blues. Several EU nations were rocked by strikes in response to impending belt-tightening measures mandated by Brussels. When the dust settles, who will be calling the economic tune in Europe's capitals? We're joined once again by our panel of Roundup regulars. John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamilton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who has also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Executive Director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
John, I'd like to start with you, if I could, and Korea. What happened this week in Korea?
Well, we're seeing the beginning of a succession, and how this plays out is yet remains to be seen. But I think we should go back to the period when the current leader, Kim Jong-il, replaced his father, Kim Il-sung, in 1994. The elder Kim Il-sung had balanced off the various competing interests in North Korea, the party, the military, the cabinet, and the family. And so he kind of rode over these things and used one against the other. When Kim Jong-il came in, there was a certain amount of resentment within the North Korean elite to the way in which he came to power. And so he allied himself with the military and kind of changed the dynamic of what was happening in North Korean politics. Come forward to 2010, Kim Jong-un, or as I would have started this off by calling it one-unmanship, he is now being announced. He's 28 years old, he's Swiss educated, he has no military experience, he has no visibility within North Korean society. Now he's a 4-star general and the vice chairman of an important central military commission. He was announced at the Workers' Party Congress. So this may be an attempt to try and rebalance the politics within North Korea, taking the military down a notch, bringing the party up. There's another duel that needs to be watched. Kim Jong-il, the current leader's sister, was also made a 4-star general. And she and her husband, some think, could be the caretakers to watch the period ahead as Kim Jong-un begins to take on more roles within the North Korean politics.
So, Ann, do we know anything about Kim Jong-un other than his age and that he was educated in Switzerland?
Apparently he likes to play basketball, and they don't really know very much about him. I mean, hasn't been, as far as we know, because there's a lot we don't know, he hasn't been groomed, for this position in the sense of regular, courses or any kind of position that he's been put in to try and train him for this. So he's new. He's
It's nice to start off at the top.
Right, you know, he's a real unknown, and that could cause a lot of problems, because if there was resentment when his father came in, then clearly now not only is it the longest serving dynasty in the world apparently at this point, but you know, it flies in the face of Communist Party doctrine, which doesn't allow for, you know, succession of father to son. So, and he's completely unprepared. So it is an unpredictable and unstable time.
So what about that, Robert? What are some possible scenarios when the father passes from the scene and the son takes over?
Well, I mean, everyone's guessing. So you see a lot of tea leaves being written in the analyses. No one's really sure what the balance of power is. This system they've set up, which would not flies in the face of communist doctrine, obviously, is more like the monarchical system, and that always floundered on you were eventually going to hit a weak link, that maybe a father would be a strong leader and a son. Whatever you think of the two Kims, they were strong leaders. They created a bizarre society that's bad for its people and is destabilizing, but they were strong. So it's unlikely that unless there's some brilliant, you know, leader hidden here, that we don't know that, but I mean, it's very unlikely. And so it's likely that not only that we're not sure who's in power, maybe the brother-in-law and the sister are more in power. We're not sure how this privileges the various parts of the society that John laid out. And it's likely, there's a very good chance in most scenarios it's going to lead to more instability at some stage, and that brings into play China and the United States and their competing interests, and the nuclear arsenals in all three countries, and South Korea. So it's probably, it's inevitable, because there is going to be a succession at some point, and it's probably dangerous. Maybe it can be gotten through to the point where we can resolve this and it can become a more normal country that's part of the international community, but there's probably a lot of instability and danger in between.
Having watched Yugoslavia as it dissembled in the 80s and 90s, there's an element here. This is a pressure cooker, and there's a lid on it, and when that lid comes off, this is going to be ugly. And China and South Korea have much to be worried about because of refugee flows and the destabilizing effect this could have on their societies.
So if you're going to handicap the situation, what is your best guess as far as likely outcomes? Is there any way this is going to be a smooth transition?
I think it depends on how, to a certain extent, obviously, on how long Kim Jong-il hangs in there, and if he doesn't become incapacitated, you know, and sort of just be a complete figurehead. So that's really the big unknown. I think he's 68 years old, so he's not terribly old, but he's been in very poor health, so we don't really know.
Well, let's stay in Asia if we could. And there was a action in the U.S. House regarding China's currency. First, tell us what the issue this bill was trying to address is.
There has long been concern that the Chinese have been keeping their currency valued artificially low by various manipulations, but when they buy up a lot of foreign currency to keep the yuan artificially low, and that of course affects relative prices of exports and imports. So the allegation has been that this has made it Chinese items going to the exports to the United States and elsewhere cheaper than they would be if the currency were allowed to float freely on the market. And they estimate that if it were allowed to float freely, it would rise by about 20 to 40%.
So when you go to your favorite shop and buy your package of Chinese-made T-shirts, they'd be 20 to 40% more expensive than they are now.
Well, that's unclear, because the economists are really divided on this. Some say that actually Chinese exporters have adjusted their prices to ensure that when they reach certain markets, the prices won't be much higher. Others say that because of the length of time that we've been trading with the Chinese since they introduced their reforms, that the United States has stopped producing a number of the items, if we're talking about the United States here, which we are, a number of the items that, so we don't even make them domestically anymore. So there's a certain amount of price inelasticity there. It's not clear that the amount the price would rise would actually dramatically affect the overall trade deficit. And people cite, some economists look at the fact that since 2005, the UN has been allowed to rise about 20%, and this is not it hasn't, it hasn't reduced the amount of Chinese exports to the United States or the trade deficit. So it hasn't performed the way it's supposed to, the economy.
So, Robert, if this may or may not be a large trade balance issue, what's behind the action in the U.S. House?
Well, it's a large public issue because our manufacturing economy has been gutted over the last couple of decades, and we've not replaced it with other family-supporting jobs. And so people are angry about it. Public opinion is run very much against all of the international trade agreements. They've been done anyway because of how political power is organized in our country. And so it is popular, bipartisan issue. I think Ann's right. It might fixing this might not bring the jobs back, but it's certainly a stronger argument that it helped make the jobs leave in the first place. Or in other words, even if fixing it now wouldn't bring the manufacturing jobs back to the United States. And the estimate from the Economic Policy Institute is that 52,000 Wisconsin jobs have been lost this decade because of unfair trade with China. And if you look at the vote of the Wisconsin congressional delegation, 7 of the 8 voted for it. Only Paul Ryan voted against it, who is further right than most people realize, but even Sensenbrenner voted for it. And it's because the public wants some real action to restore jobs, and jobs is the biggest issue right now, and this is a tangible thing that people understand, that is that we've lost jobs to China and other countries.
What Robert is saying in this paid political announcement is that we're coming into an election. And this is very much related. It is very comfortable for almost everyone to come home to their constituents and say, we beat up the Chinese. This still has to go to the Senate, and the Senate isn't going to pick this up before the election. And the president, from what I have read, has not been particularly warm towards this sort of legislation to be able to deal with our relationship with China.
Well, if this has more to do with optics and atmospherics than economics, is there a Chinese analog to this? I mean, what's the likely Chinese reaction to even going this far?
I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question. They have come out with a statement saying that they are not in favor of this piece of legislation, but I suspect that they have people who are knowledgeable enough to be able to say, it's an election year. The Senate's not going to move on this. This is going to probably get lost in the near future. Don't worry about it.
So it's just rhetoric on both sides.
Well, and it's just one of many, many. I mean, 2/3 of the anti-dumping cases that are before the United States are brought against Chinese firms. So that it's a long line of measures taken in this area.
And I'm not suggesting that there isn't an issue here, but this probably isn't the vehicle to deal with it.
John's probably right. The Senate isn't going to do anything, and the administration wouldn't go along. But and so therefore, China probably won't be overly offended because it's not likely to happen. But it's more than optics in the sense that just like the pressure cooker in Korea, the jobs issue is a pressure cooker in this country. The global economy is one of the main drivers of the loss of value-supporting jobs, and this just pushes it down the road with more pressure because it's the establishment not being able to do anything real that people want them to do, regardless whether you think this is the solution or not.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, and we'll take a short break. We'll be right back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup. Well, Robert, we had a continuation of sorts of the negotiations between the Palestinian and Israeli leadership. Where do we stand right now?
Well, when we last had this panel, we were talking about the problem that the 10-month moratorium on new settlements was going to expire, and the Palestinians were saying they were going to leave the negotiations if it wasn't continued, and Netanyahu said he was going to let it expire. That has now happened, and now the Palestinians and Abbas are saying that they'll withdraw from the negotiations. There is an Arab League meeting next week, so there's some space to try to work something out, but it is increasingly hard to see what that ground for compromise would be. I think the whole panel was skeptical about these talks. At least I'm glad the administration is trying. It's crucially important to try, but with the current situation with what the government is in Israel and what the Likud here, and in addition with the Palestinians being divided and much of their leadership not being at the table because Hamas is not in, that these were very long odds, lottery-like odds to begin with, that it would succeed. It's looking at this taping like it's going to end early, and that we're not even going to have negotiations. I think probably the administration and Hillary Clinton are working hard to figure out how to at least keep it going so there's some chance of it not crashing and burning immediately and looking like a complete failure on their part.
Well, Ann, is there anything the U.S. administration can do to try to intervene and get over this first hurdle of the settlements?
Well, they can do a couple things. They can try to persuade Netanyahu with various incentives, but it doesn't look as if he's going to bite. And they could call the Israeli bluff to a certain extent and say, okay, one of the options is we're going to come out and endorse the boundaries of a Palestinian state, and which apparently are nearly in place. And
what do you think the odds of that?
Well, I don't know. If I were the administration, I'd be pretty frustrated because I think that it doesn't look as if Netanyahu is really behind this at all. And there seems to be a lot of bluffing going on here, particularly, given the fact that his foreign minister got up at the UN and made some statements that suggested that there wouldn't be any permanent peace settlement for another generation, and that this was really an exercise in futility, and the reaction of Netanyahu was to really do nothing.
Well, what about that, John? I mean, clearly the ostensible position of Netanyahu and his foreign minister was miles apart. I mean, he was supportive of the concept.
Coalitions.
So his reaction or non-reaction to his foreign minister making remarks that would really sort of belie what he had done up to this point. Does that say anything about?
Well, going back to what we talked about 2 weeks ago, I remain a skeptic on this whole process. I don't think that the tea leaves or the positions were such that would have allowed this to move forward. The fact that Abbas is speaking only for half of the Palestinians, that Hamas is not part of this discussion, cripples the process. The fact that Netanyahu is reported to be very uninterested in seeing this all come about. The fact that we're going into an election cycle, and this also plays in kind of like the UN in terms of how it impacts on our domestic scene.
Well, if it sounds like the panel is more or less united in its skepticism.
Let me raise one other point that it plays out in the background, and this is the Sunni-Shia struggle within the larger Middle East. And Saudi Arabia has become very active. There are reports that Syria has replaced some of its security and intelligence leaders with people much more attuned to what the Saudi position is. There's a report from Hezbollah accusing Jordan and Egypt of arming militias to fight against them. So you really need to look at this. The Middle East is not just the Arabs, the Palestinians and the Israelis coming to agreement. It's a much larger issue.
Well, and apropos of the Saudis, the Saudi foreign minister characterized this as failure being too catastrophic to imagine. So is this the case? If the negotiations do end prematurely with no result, is it catastrophic?
No.
Well, that's terse.
It's only catastrophic if we can't see what's going to happen. If it leads to tremendous amount of violence and escalation of particularly violence through Hamas and the other groups that are supported by other, and sort of turns into a regional armed conflict, then it will be catastrophic. So.
But wasn't this also just a good way in which to catch their breath? I mean, for the various parties involved.
But I would say this is a very dangerous situation. The longer a dangerous situation is perpetuated, the more likelihood there is of a catastrophe. And so, where it's going to come, whether if we have to do it now or it'll be next year, you can't predict. But eventually, it's going to catch up with us, and we're going to lose moderate Arab regimes. There's going to be another major war. There are nuclear weapons involved. Iran may have nuclear weapons. So the longer you perpetuate this crisis, there's going to be a catastrophe. Whether it's next year or 10 years, hard to know.
Well, let's leave Western Asia and head to Europe, where there were conflicts as well, but of a different nature. John, would you tell us a little bit about who's protesting and what it's all about?
Europe is going through something similar to what we were talking about earlier about the relations with China. They're losing their manufacturing base, their worker, the relationship between their workers and the industry and the financial elite is worsening. This downturn has hit them very, very hard, and there's a quote that I'd like to share with our viewers that comes out of this and gives a sense of how some of the workers look at this process. And it says, quote, "If we were paid better pensions, then older workers would retire sooner, and younger, more efficient workers could be hired." And it's that lack of understanding of how economics work and how a business is put together that is part of the problem that they face.
Well, and what's coming out of this is clearly a sense that the organized labor in many countries, I think there were active protests in 13 or more, is feeling like the burden for coming out of this economic downturn is being disproportionately placed on them. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what some of the mandated austerity measures are that had precipitated this. I mean, what kinds of things is the European Commission particularly asking of these governments?
Well, the European Commission is asking governments to, as part of the conditions of joining the Eurozone, they agreed to keep their budget deficits within 3% of their GDP. And none of the countries have done this, and there's been no enforcement mechanism. So now the Commission has decided that it's going to sanction the countries in some way. But governments had already, before they announced this plan, governments had already been, with the Greece crisis and all, and had been instituting measures that would cut, make public workers contribute more to their pension funds, raise retirement ages, which has been, like in France, that's been very controversial, from 60 to 62 in 2018. Different ways to bring down the bloated public sector. And so it's interesting because culturally it's something that we have a difficult time understanding, because the European countries have had such extensive welfare systems and so many benefits for labor that's been sort of the social contract with their governments, and to take that away is making them question the legitimacy of their governments. So it's more serious than it sounds to us when we sort of say, oh my gosh, they're thinking of raising the retirement age from 60 to 62. Well, obviously, if workers work longer, despite the quote that John has, and they take their pensions for less time, fewer years, then it's going to cost the government less. So they're sweeping measures that a lot of governments are taking. The strikes that took place this week were in response, they were called out by the European Confederation of Labor for Public Workers to protest the move by the European Commission, but it's part of a longer process, as we saw with Greece this summer.
Well, Robert, we've got about a minute left. A lot of the protests centered in Brussels at the European Commission. What is the relationship between these mandates at sort of the EU level and sort of sovereignty issues within each national government?
It's a good point, because it's a different dynamic than we have. We don't have a federation of different countries. So there are some similarities. They're very frustrated. They think the banks and the finance sector caused this financial crisis, and for average people, you have to pay for it. That same frustration exists in the United States. Anne's right, there's a much larger public sector there, a more extensive welfare state, but we're going to face these same things in about a year. There's a lot of push for fiscal austerity in the United States, and so the equivalent is cutting Social Security, cutting Medicare, raising the retirement age for Social Security, and that's going to be under discussion here within a year. But the other complication, as you point out, Doug, is you have an EU, and so you have them trying to set policy for all of the countries. And so you have coordinated protests across 16 different countries and at a center at the EU in Brussels, which is a very different dynamic and challenges the whole idea of having an EU.
Well, I'm sorry, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you once again to our viewers. We'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,